Today, we're going to talk about 3 people who are suspected to have died from spontaneous combustion. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. July 2nd, 1951 was really a pretty average day in St. Petersburg, Florida. Pansy Carpenter dropped by one of her tenant's apartments to deliver a telegram. That tenant was Mary Reeser. When Carpenter arrived to deliver this telegram, she of course knocked on the door, but she wasn't getting any answers. And when she put her hand on the doorknob, it was unusually hot. So of course this set off alarm bells. Was the house on fire? The police and firefighters get there and they break down the door, and what they found was completely mind-boggling, even to today's standards. So obviously they break down the door and they get inside and they find Mary Reeser, the 67-year-old woman, dead. Not only is she dead, she's literally burnt to ash. Not much of her body was left. They found a slippered foot, which showed no sign of charring, and they found a part of her spine. They also found a piece of her skull, which was described as shrunken. And although the apartment was warm when the police arrived, the majority of the apartment remained intact. Plastic household objects that had been sitting next to Mary were obviously warm and had lost their shape, but they hadn't completely melted. What's even more strange is the fact that the room was seemingly unaffected by the flames that had engulfed her. Of course, the rug had a scorch mark on it, but there was really no other evidence of a fire. And it's important to note that it takes a very high temperature to cremate a body. I think it's something along the lines of like 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And not only does it require super high temperature, it also requires 3 to 4 hours to do so. And of course, this is completely jarring to police. They find a slipper with a foot still in it that has no charring and no burn marks. They find a skull that's shrunken, and they find a piece of her spine. The house is still intact. And the fact that the apartment was relatively unscorched by this supposed fire is also pretty mysterious. And because her apartment was relatively untouched by this fire, investigators were confused. There was even a stack of newspaper right next to the chair which she died in, and it had 0 scorching on it. And for those of you that don't know what spontaneous combustion is, it is as it sounds. When this happens, supposedly a person just literally bursts into flames, and it's due to a chemical reaction within inside the body. So of course the FBI actually analyzed her remains and ruled that this wasn't a possibility. The FBI would conclude her death was due to a cigarette. They said that she fell asleep with a cigarette in her hand and that her body fat basically provided the fuel for this fire. It's important to note that she was around 170 pounds at the time of her death. So the FBI concluded basically that she had been sitting in her chair and she fell asleep with a lit cigarette in her hand, and that her body fat kind of fueled the fire, which to me doesn't really sound plausible. And I must note that I'm not a fire expert by any means. Really doesn't seem plausible that a lit cigarette, which can cause fires, I do want to put that out there, they can cause fires, but a lit cigarette fell onto her and made her literally into ash, except for a few pieces of her. That really sounds suspicious to me. And then a professor of physical anthropology said that he didn't actually agree with the FBI's ruling. And not only was he a professor of physical anthropology, he was also an experienced fire researcher. And this professor would go on to say that he couldn't conceive the fact that it burnt her body to ash but didn't touch the rest of the apartment to the same degree. In this next case, a 65-year-old man was also believed to die from spontaneous combustion. In Oklahoma, a man known as Danny Vansant, who was a 65-year-old, died after burning for 10 hours. And his house, too, was left largely untouched by the fire. And when neighbors saw the smoke coming from the house, of course they called police. When they arrived, the body was pretty much incinerated. On the floor below the 65-year-old was not damaged at all. There was no sign of fire damage. And they obviously checked for accelerants used to speed up the burning of the body, and they didn't find any accelerants either. So of course they did a thorough post-mortem examination, and they found that there was no soot in the lungs, meaning Danny wasn't alive when the fire started. He hadn't inhaled any smoke. And they actually later ruled his death of dying from a heart attack. And of course, they said that he was a heavy drinker and a smoker. And that day in particular, he had been smoking. And as he was smoking, he had a heart attack and fell over and obviously laid on his cigarette, much like they said had happened to Mary. And as he's falling over, he still has a cigarette in his hands. And of course, he died. And then a fire started and charred his body, I guess, for 10 hours. And I want to note that there's many cases similar to this that are actually quite suspicious. If you believe in spontaneous human combustion, obviously that does offer some explanation. Most of the time, people don't believe in that. And a similar case happened in 1956. A woman named Virginia Caggett, she walked into the room of young, sick Kim to find him engulfed in blue flames. And by the time police and the fire department arrived, Kim and his chair were actually in ashes, and none of the apartment had suffered as a result due to the fire, like the clothing and the nearby curtains, in spite of the fierce heat. That's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. See you next time.